Hey folks, this is Greg from Art Can Help. I haven't posted in a while, and I've decided to try a new video. There's lots of reasons why I haven't made any videos recently, mostly because the last 10 months I've been working on a large installation, art installation, and that's wrapping up. So I'll be done with that soon, and hopefully I'll get back to some of the videos I've been doing. But over the last about 10 months to a year, I've been thinking a lot about this channel, and at the same time, I've been reading the work of Ian McGilchrist, specifically The Master and His Emissary, and now I'm almost finished with The Matter with Things. McGilchrist sets out a very compelling argument, in my opinion, about the nature of our society and how it relates to the structure of our brains and all of this. Whether he's right or not with all of his cultural kinds of claims, I'm not certain. Personally, I would say I'm quite compelled by his argument. But I've noticed the way that his writing relates to me is really some of the reasons why I started this channel and why I began it as the Robert Adams book title, Art Can Help. And that is that I've seen art help me in my life in a lot of different ways. And I want people to receive that kind of experience with art as well. And so most of the videos have been somewhat theoretical, sometimes art historical, oftentimes video essays. Then, of course, last fall I did the conversation with Gabe, and we read through a bunch of interesting writings on what is going on in art. My thoughts have developed since then, and so I want to put together a series that is going in tandem with my basic design course that I teach here at Hope College. And the reason being, if I distill McGilchrist down I mean, these are tomes he's writing, and so I'm turning this into like 2 sentences, which does not do it justice, but he would basically say that there's a reason why we have 2 hemispheres in our brain, and that these make us have different types of two different distinct ways of perceiving the world. And the way that the words he uses to really simply do this is to say that your right hemisphere is for comprehending the world, and your left hemisphere is for apprehending the world, grasping onto and using. And that a balanced individual is using both of these hemispheres in tandem, where the right hemisphere is first perceiving, the left hemisphere is incorporating, working, discovering, and utilizing, and then passing back to the right hemisphere for you to re-perceive the world now that you have this information. And his main argument is that in the West in particular, that we are left hemisphere dominated, and that we do not use our right hemispheres enough. I have seen this in my own life. When I was younger, I was far more analytical. I had a much harder time understanding art. And then in my art training, I somehow grew a far larger imagination, which, as McGilchrist argues, the imagination is part of the right hemisphere to a large degree. And I've been thinking about this because McGilchrist does not want to give prescriptions for how to solve this crisis. He does give some hints, in his opinion, as to what they are, and the main reason he doesn't want to give a step-by-step thing is because that is feeding into the left hemisphere. As soon as we make it a program, it is no longer the free, ready to comprehend. It is instead a apprehended, set in stone kind of thing, which is exactly the problem in McGilchrist's mind. So I've been thinking about that because the videos I make, I think, do have a revealing aspect to specific works of art. You know, when I talk about Van Gogh, then people have a better sense of that Van Gogh. But I've been wondering if they're gaining a better insight and an ability to understand. And frankly, I don't think they are. I think that the biggest problem is that it's very difficult in a lecture format or a singular delivery format rather than a dialogical format to experience the kinds of things that a creative practice entails. So I want to go through kind of the lecture side of my design courses, and this is mainly to kind of make an argument for why you should engage in communities like what a studio art course at most colleges is trying to do. This is not an argument. I know there's lots of people who are trying to redefine universities and colleges right now. A major part of that I support. I'm not a fan of sitting in lecture halls, which is why I don't lecture very much. Instead, I engage in conversations. So that's what I'm going to do with this. This semester, I'm just teaching 2 basic design classes. And my thoughts are that when there are these kind of aspects of the course that are important and interesting that I can use to kind of point to why taking a course is helpful, I'm going to post a video about it. And so I'm going to go into what do I do on day 1 of my basic design class. But there's one other caveat I want to add, and that is simply that I do not think a college course is the necessary thing to do this. There are tons of creative communities. I'm thinking of places like the Rabbit Room, or a place that I've published and enjoy what they've been releasing, called Anselm Society. But there have been artist collectives all over for way before colleges existed. So when I was in Boston, I was a part of St. Botolph's Club, which is kind of a more high-minded form of that thing. But there are ways that people can engage in communities that do this. College classes and courses are a way to very quickly find a community rather than having to build up a friend network, all of these different things. There's tons of barriers to entry, and I find as a college professor that one of the best things that happens in college is that community is by default if you're enrolled in the class. So you get a variety of viewpoints, not everyone's friends, and so you can have some really interesting feedback and conversations as long as everyone's respectful. And so that's my kind of push for traditional colleges as they stand today, why you might consider this. And hopefully the things that I talk about, you can see the value that you would have in actually practicing and not just hearing about. So here at Hope College, one of the main points, my syllabi is over there, so I'm looking over there for reference occasionally, is that this falls into the gen ed curriculum. This 100 level class does. It falls into the gen ed curriculum. And we have a requirement that everyone at Hope gets some sort of arts in practice, whether that's in any of the arts. I believe that would be here at Hope. That'd be theater, dance, music, visual art, and I think creative writing, but I can't remember if that falls under the category of English or not. But it's because there's a difference in doing. I can read all about, firing a bow, and I can watch videos, but it doesn't. It pales in comparison until you start actually firing a bow. The same is true of creativity, of making things. So I'm not going to show you my syllabi because that's it's a bunch of gobbledygook. In McGilchrist speak, it's left hemisphere talk. That is highly academic and highly precise in order to fulfill certain requirements that accreditors come in. And so students are free to read it, but this is how I like to start my class. I like to ask on the first day, what is design? And how do you know a thing has been designed? And you get tons of different answers. The majority of answers are things like things that have been made by human beings, things that show creativity. Sometimes you'll get visual communication or specifics like, web design. Web design is design. It's got it in the name. These kinds of things. And so I like to do this. I'm trying to get a feel of what is the baseline here. Every class is different, and students are constantly changing. That's for sure. And so I like to get a feel when I say this word, which I have a definition of design, I'm not trying to fish for that. I'm not hoping they answer it correctly. I want them to answer honestly because I want to know where are they and what do I need to define? What terms do we have in common and how do I figure that out? And so then I like to say, name me a designed object. And you're going to find that my default is going to be a chair. I'm always going to talk about chairs. But they might say all kinds of different things. But, let's take a chair. How do you know a chair has been designed? What is it about the chair that you're that's a product of design? I like to say this since, we have this term by design. How do you know that the chair was made by design? And so we have conversations around that. And ultimately it comes down to there's a perception in those objects that there's a use and that they fit the use very nicely. And so therefore, this couldn't have happened randomly, but probably this was done by some form of an intentional practice, some sort of process that led to the creation of this object. And that's really a great place to start when you're thinking about design. So often what design is doing is it's finding a problem and it's solving it. The reason you know the chair was designed is because it seems to a good chair seems to fit the problem. People need places to sit. They want them to be comfortable, and they need to, like, not destroy their backs, especially if you've got a bad back like me. And so a well-designed chair fulfills those things so well that it would be very odd to assume that it just kind of arrived out of nowhere. Which, I don't know, if you've gone on hikes up into mountains and you found cool little natural chairs, you find some of these rocks that actually seem to be really good chairs. Maybe that's how human beings got the ideas to make chairs in the first place. I don't know. But it's at least a good place to start, is to think this happened by some design. And so then I think I like to talk through students. So what is a design process? I'm going to go ahead and switch over to a different camera view so you can see like what I write about and what I draw on boards here. I like to talk about the design process as defined by IDEO, which is a group out by Stanford, I think, or something like that. And they set up a couple different steps, and they call it specifically design thinking. But the thing I liked about it is that they have, sometimes there's 5 steps, sometimes there's 6. But I realized that you could take what they're doing and simplify it, and you can talk about any creative practice. I mean, anytime a human being is engaging in creativity, they're going to be interacting with several different steps. I like to call them, here we go, explore, refine. You can see my variation and how wonderful my handwriting is. I'm going to call this crit, which would be critique, and then analyze. And then usually you see something like this, as in this is the flow of it, and it's sort of an iterative process where you're going from exploration to refinement to critique to analyzing the critique you receive, and you go back through that and you do this cycle over and over. So why do I want to make this broader than what IDEO says? Because they talk about this in the context of design. When there's one step that I've removed from their thing, but so ultimately, when anyone is creating something, they're generally going to be exploring a bit. They're going to start off with some sort of, you might call this brainstorming. If you're a pianist and you're playing piano, this might be when you're doing your scales and you're not really thinking. And once your scales are like finishing up and you're warmed up, and then suddenly you kind of just, maybe you allow yourself to riff with it. Just dabbling, playing, like in the childish sense of the term, playing with the notes. Maybe you are making unique iterations, and a lot of it's going to be bad. If you're a sketch artist, you're going to be just drawing in your sketchbook. You can see my sketchbook here, like all of the different things that you just sketch. You make stuff that is not necessarily finished and not necessarily that important. You're just exploring ideas. Then you're going to find some of those ideas. Lots of them are going to be bad. I've talked about this in many instances, but a friend of mine in Boston said that for every good painting, there's 500 bad ones. So you're selecting several of the things you find in the explore category to refine those presentation to an audience. There are lots of folks who are just purely creative, who you could call these outsider artists, who aren't interested in showing work. They just kind of, maybe they live in this, maybe they come to refine sometimes just for their own personal taste, but they're never actually showing it to an audience, though you could argue that the artist is actually the first audience member. But refining for presentation. Then you put it in front of people to get critiqued, to receive feedback, and you listen to that feedback. If you're not listening to the feedback, well, you're probably very arrogant, like, Disney or something like that. Then you analyze that feedback. If you're not an arrogant mega conglomeration that buys up everything, you analyze that feedback in order to go back into the exploration phase. And so that sounds really nice and neat. In reality and practice, this is not nearly that neat. As soon as I start writing, and I think I just started writing in lowercase, why did I do that? My lowercase writing is like a child. I'm already refining myself. I'm already saying like, nope, not good enough. Change, adapt, keep going, make it better, and go like that. And sometimes so I'm refining, I'm already critiquing it. Maybe I'm over-analyzing it. You never know. That's a very big problem, obviously. But it's this back and forth. So really, it looks something like you're jumping all around, and you're doing all these different things. And So how does this relate to design? This is where the next question I like to ask is, what's the difference between art and design? Because so often students will say something like, oh, it's about expression, self-expression. But I'm thinking, back to that chair. It's pretty rare that a chair would be a designer or an artist's self-expression. It's possible. In fact, I know one of my graduate advisors, Barbara Gallucci, makes a lot of really expressive chairs. But it's not usual. It's not the norm, that's for sure. So what is like happening there? And well, we go back to that thing of the reason we know something is by design is because it had an intention behind it. It had a problem it was trying to address or solve. And that's where I like to talk about this, like this is a flat thing, but in 3 dimensions, there's another point somewhere out here hovering in front of it, which is my finger when we design. And that is the problem we're trying to solve. And so you can think about this, one of the examples I used recently, if you're a fan of Michigan, there are Adirondack chairs like crazy around here, and tons of people make them in the shape of a nice little Michigan mitten hand. And I'm like, that's a creative enterprise. A lot of people can do that. And you go out, you can buy a template, you can follow the template, you can cut it all into the pieces you need, you can put it all together, you can sit in it and critique it. And that's kind of like a creative process without the top here, because you're not doing the exploration. Someone else did. The person who made the original layout for that woodworking project did all the exploring of trying, well, what if we try it like this? What if we use these fasteners? What if we're using dowels or, biscuits or what kind of joinery, all of that. They're doing the exploration, and they finished it. They refined it. They gave it to some people. Those people were able to make chairs out of it. And so they found that was good enough, and they were done with the iterative process. You come in, you buy that thing. You don't need to do any exploration. You just need to follow the directions, refine your cuts. Maybe you have to do some exploration and maybe you don't have all the tools. So you have to figure out, can I cut this with my handsaw? So there might be some level of exploration, but very little. It's mostly going to be following directions towards a refinement, showing it to your wife to make sure it'll be okay on the front deck. If it's not, back deck, I suppose. And you're analyzing that feedback, and you're kind of just in here. But when we're being generative, when we're being creative in that sense of something new, there's always this exploration process, even if you have a defined goal. And this is why I like to teach design in the context of art, which is why I've taught a lot of different places. When I've taught in design programs, it is this is way less emphasized, even though if you look at some of the best designers, like some of my favorites would be Stefan Sagmeister and Jessica Walsh, Martin Vanesky, Elliot Earls. They are artists in their core, in the sense of, I would argue that designers, before they start this, they set a problem. Artists do not. Artists just jump in and start exploring and wonder where they're going to go. So in the sense of, if a designer has a rule, I need to make a chair, they can make a chair that fails, and then that chair is a bad design. Artists, though, they might be exploring. Maybe they're making chairs and they're exploring with those chairs. And maybe the chair can't hold human weight, and maybe it's not comfortable. That actually could be an interesting artwork. Rather, it would be a bad design, but it could be a good artwork. So that's kind of what I'm trying to get at here. And then I talk through, let me switch back here. I talk through my grading rubric and all of this with the students, looking at this sense of exploration, refinement, critique, and analyzing. You might ask, in fact, I've had colleagues ask me here from the sciences, how do you grade art projects? Isn't it all subjective? And there's lots of ways in which attraction towards the final projects that students submit might be subjective. I think there's a lot more objectivity than you would expect. There also is general trends. Again, Sagmeister and Walsh have a great book on beauty, about how many senses of beauty are universal cross-culturally to human beings, which is very unique, something that most people don't take into account. They fall victim to that beauty's in the eye of the beholder. It's like, it kind of is and it kind of isn't. Again, I'm going to rely on McGilchrist for that there. So we talk about what is design, what's the difference between art and design, and I like to say that the reason you come here to a college class is not to learn the techniques. So I'm going to be grading techniques that will come under the refinement category there. How well can a student achieve something? And specifically in my design classes, we're learning Photoshop and Illustrator. So they're going to have some techniques that they need to do, and they'll get graded on that, obviously. But then we're going to have this other thing of like, how do you make cool new things? How do you expand yourself? How do you become more imaginative? And that's what we're going to engage in. I learned Photoshop and Illustrator beginning in 1997 by myself with the internet and just trying to figure things out and clicking buttons. Anyone, in my opinion, probably anyone, can learn those technical tools. They don't need to pay college tuition for that, that's for sure. And that's why I don't just teach that. That is a part of the class, but the main bulk of the class is this process here, is this sense of how do you figure out how to do this? And that's why, again, going back to that communal thing, why is a studio class? First of all, they're much longer than lecture classes. We meet for 5 hours a week as opposed to 2.5 or 3 hours a week that the lecture classes do. And we involve the students. They are doing things and they are talking to each other because they need to go through this. They need to receive critique. They need to analyze the critique. They need to understand, what do I do when I don't like what someone said? How do I respond to that? What do I do when someone I have a crush on doesn't like what I made? How do I respond to that? All of this creativity, human creativity, does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in the context of communities and human beings making things together. And the reason we design things is so often for others, whether you think that's arrogant or not, or useful, or wonderful, or a gift. I don't know. There's all kinds of ways. That would be like the ethics of design. There's all kinds of ways you can think about that. But it's true that I make things hoping other people will enjoy them, will find them valuable. And how am I going to know if I've succeeded unless I show it to people and I watch their responses? So that's why we're doing this in a community, and that's why a studio class is very hard to replicate in an online environment. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it is very difficult. I've tried. It didn't work very well. I will talk about my rubric. What am I grading? I recently retitled these just to make them a little bit more natural for students to understand. Let me scroll to it. Here it is. On their projects, it's broken into 4 categories of grading. One is imagination, the second is problem solving, the third is process, the fourth is collaboration. If you look back to this mode here, they're kind of responding to this. So imagination would be, is it new? Is it interesting? Is it novel? And that's going to be someone who's really good in the exploration phase, that their imagination is guiding them and they're dreaming up new possibilities. Problem solving is going to be the refinement phase. How well did you solve the problem? Oftentimes, the art students are going to be more interested in exploration and imagination. The design and marketing students are going to be more interested in refinement. But the reality is we need both. There's tons of artists who are not good at presenting their work to audiences in a way that it is well received. And there are tons of marketers who are not imaginative enough. That's why this class is for both of those types of students. Then we get down to the process. The process would be, did you fulfill all the steps? And did you allow, which part of that process is receiving feedback and analyzing it and adjusting? Or do you throw your stuff up on the wall and then you don't listen, you're on your phone and you're not actually paying attention? That would be a process. So this would be your imagination category. This would be your problem solving category. Process is in both of these. And so is collaboration. Collaboration would be, did you critique well? And did you incorporate that and into your work? Did you listen to others? Did you disagree with them in interesting ways? Did you kind of say, hey, I heard your critique and I disagreed. And so I tried to make it a little bit different to try to convince you that it's better my way, not your way, and engage in that conversation. And so that's where that grading comes in. So that's what I'm grading, is I'm not necessarily just grading the outcome. I'm grading the process, because this is the thing that it's very difficult to learn in isolation by watching something online. Engaging in this process is how you get better at it. There's this great book by I don't know if I'd say it's a great book. If you listen to the conversation dialogue series that I did there's a book by James Elkins called Why Art Cannot Be Taught. And he is making the assumption that the art that we are looking at is that the thing that's being taught is how to make the artwork, almost like a step-by-step. Like, how do you solve a quadratic equation? And it's not that. It's more like teaching something like, how do you be a scientist? What do you think about the scientific method? How do you engage in it? This is one way of conceptualizing how do you be creative. I think it's a very good way to do it. It's very encompassing, and it is extremely open. If you want to think about, how do I design a class? You can make exploration. You can start by exploring different ideas, figuring out which ones are closest to the outcomes you're interested in, testing it with students and peers, talking to them about it, analyzing how that went, and continue iterating. This is what I do every year with a class. This video series is going to be part of it. So I finish up that first day with an exercise where we talk about the very basics of how do we build compositions, how do we think visually about design, because we are going to be working in this two-dimensional realm for this course. And that's where I introduce this notion. There are principles and elements of design. Google them. You find videos all over the place with these things. People define them in different ways, but at their very core, when you're building something, when you're making something, when you're making a chalkboard behind you, you've got some things that you can make that with. Those would be our elements. What are the most simple elements in order to start making a two-dimensional composition? And then our principles would be larger things that are kind of built off of built up from the elements. When you arrange elements in a certain way, they start to tend towards certain phenomena that human beings experience when they look at things. So we don't really get into the principles yet, but we start with elements, and I give them a strange set of instructions that start helping them think about how do they explore these elements. So the first most simple element in a two-dimensional, technically 3D as well, but two-dimensional setting is a dot, a little point in space. And then we start drawing some lines, and then thinking about shapes. And then we think about negative space, which would be foreground, background space. What is the space that is neutralized by an object? If I let me switch over here. If you're looking at this and I were to like fill this in as this is just a big blobby shape, this would be the positive space that comes forward into your vision, so to speak. It bounces off the page while the background recedes. And it's very hard for human beings to look at this and spend time observing these zones out here. So like it's hard. Your eye is drawn to this. Why? Because this is like in some way positively charged. So we talk about those with some interesting stuff. That's our first. So yeah, that is our first day, our first introduction to design. What are we trying to do? Why are we doing it? Why can this be useful to anyone? And this is, again, getting at that message of my channel. Art can help. There seems to be a problem, if McGilchrist is right, that so few of us are imaginative and good at being creative, thinking outside the box. We're all becoming extremely good at following directions and doing things within these little systems. And I think the answer is you should take an art class. You should engage in this and get better at thinking up new ideas and exploring. And it's amazing how it opens up the world to you. And yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'll also end with a little story of my own. Like, I used to think of hikes as in like hiking through the woods. I used to think of that in a very utilitarian manner. The point of a hike was like to get somewhere and see a view, or to get the exercise in. And then we got a Siberian Husky. You can follow him on Instagram, Siberian Fox. Fox, F-A-W-K-E-S. And as we had him, he doesn't want to just go on a hike and run around and get exercise. He wants to smell things. He wants to explore. He wants to hunt. And I had to slow down. I had to start looking around. And what really started off as an annoyance, I did not allow it to annoy me. Instead, I began exploring. I let my eyes wander, and I started finding all kinds of interesting, unique things that I had never encountered and experienced in nature, simply because I hadn't looked. I'd been busy walking by. So that, to me, is deeply connected to this idea of the design of the creative practice. And I would say that art has helped me see the world as being more dense and interesting and beautiful. You know, my wife and I constantly, whenever we discover something new, especially around where we live, where we've hiked, 4 times a week for the last 6 years, that there was a really sad moment when we were talking to some folks about hiking in one of our favorite places, which is the White Mountains in New Hampshire, specifically Franconia Notch, that someone said, all the trails are the same. And I was astounded by that. Like, no, they're not. No tree is the same, let alone a trail through those mountains. Every single view of the White Mountains is different and unique. And when I read McGilchrist's book and I think about this idea, whether it is hemisphere related or not, personally, I'm pretty convinced that it is, but whether or not it's based on our brains and how we're functioning as a society, there's something strange about the fact that this is about one of the only times in history that there might exist a person who looks at all of the thousands of trails in Franconia Notch and says, yeah, they're basically the same. That is astounding. So if you like this will probably be the longest video in this series, but if you like these, stick around, and I'll see you again soon.